End times won't make you lazy. It'll make you run faster than you've ever ran before. Because you see the end is near, right? You say, hey, there's the finish line. That's not time to take a break. It's time to run harder. It's time to run faster. It's time to finish. What we're going to talk about today is what Jesus said about end times. And so we're going to start in Matthew 24. We'll bounce to Luke chapter 21. And we'll talk about some of these statements. And, people ask about prophecy and the importance of studying prophecy. But one thing is certain, that all of the prophecies that Jesus fulfilled in His first coming were fulfilled literally. And so we can expect all of the prophecies regarding His second coming to also be fulfilled literally. And so it gives us great hope and great expectation that what He said shall come to pass. And so we're going to look at some things today. Some of them have happened. Some of them are yet to happen, which is really, the entire Bible is about 1/3 of it is or was prophetic when it was written. So some of those prophecies have come to pass, some of them have yet to come to pass, but we know that the accuracy with which they've been fulfilled won't stop with the ones that have been fulfilled. It'll continue. And so Matthew chapter 23, I'm going to just read to you. I told you to turn to Matthew 24, but I just want to give you the view of kind of what's happening here, the context of Jesus, what's known in Bible school or theologically as the Olivet Discourse. The simple way to say it is just what Jesus said about end times. But the preliminary to this is that actually in Matthew 23, Jesus really scolds and rebukes the scribes and the Pharisees because for the past 3.5 years, they've rejected His messiahship. And not only have they rejected His messiahship, they worked hard on the people in the nation of Israel to cause them to reject Him as well. You remember they would kick people out of the temple. The man that was born blind and he was healed, and the parents were afraid of being excommunicated from the temple. And so they really put pressure on even the people who followed Jesus in an effort to discredit who He was and what He had come to do. So Jesus really rebukes them. And then in Matthew 23, the last few verses of the chapter, Jesus mourns over Jerusalem. And He says, "O Jerusalem, Jerusalem, the one who kills the prophets and stones those who are sent to her. How often I wanted to gather your children as a hen gathers her chicks under her wings, but you were not willing. See, your house is left to you desolate. For I say to you, you shall see me no more till you say, blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord." So He makes a prediction that this is really the end of His public ministry. Jesus ended His public ministry with a rebuke to the scribes and the Pharisees, and then He entered into His priestly ministry where He went to the cross. You follow this, He's going to give a discourse to His disciples. He's going to experience the Passover meal with His disciples. He's going to go to the garden and pray. He's going to be betrayed. The woman with the alabaster vial will anoint Him before Judas agrees to betray Him. And all of these things take place, but His public ministry as a prophet ends with this period. And He says, you're not going to see me anymore until you say, blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord. And so, in other words, there's going to be this period of time. So after Jesus said these things, He ends His public ministry. And then here we get to Matthew chapter 24 and verse 1. We have that picture of what He's saying and what He's coming from. And in Matthew 24, and we're just going to start with verses 1 through 3. He says, it says that Jesus went out and departed from the temple, and His disciples came up to Him to show Him the buildings of the temple. And Jesus said to them, do you not see all these things? Assuredly, I say to you, not one stone shall be left here upon another that shall not be thrown down. Now, as He sat on the Mount of Olives, the disciples came to Him privately, saying, tell us, when will these things be? What will be the sign of your coming and of the end of the age? So it's interesting, the disciples were specifically interested in the stones. If you read Mark's account, Mark chapter 13, verse 1, it says that as Jesus went out of the temple, one of the disciples said to him, "Teacher, see what manner of stones and what buildings are here." Luke's account says that in Luke 21, verse 5, as some spoke of the temple, how it was adorned with beautiful stones and donations. So they were not just looking at the temple, but they were actually admiring the stones. They were unique stones. They were large stones. And this was a very beautiful temple that was being reconstructed. And I believe that it was finished in 68 AD, I believe. I could be wrong about that date, but they were watching this take place, and they were commenting on the stones. And then Jesus says something specifically about the stones, didn't he? He said that there will not be one stone left upon another that will not be torn down. Well, the disciples' response to that were three specific questions. Number one, they said, when will these things be? When will be the demolition, the dismantling of the temple? When will these things that you just said take place? Number two, what will be the sign of your coming? And number three, what will be the sign of the end of the age? So they asked three specific questions, and Jesus actually answered all three of them. Now you have to look through the multiple accounts, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, to see all three answers. But Jesus did answer all three of them. But Jesus answered the third question first, and he answered the first question second, and he answered the second question third. And so he didn't answer them in order, which isn't uncommon, because whenever you're asked a question, very often, as a pastor, I get asked questions about different things, and you may have to make a certain point before answering the question in totality. This isn't unusual, but for the sake of study, we're going to discuss them in the order of their occurrence. All right? So we're going to talk about them, not necessarily the way they were asked, or the way that they were answered, but we will talk about them in the order that they have occurred or will occur, because some are yet to happen. So first of all, we have the destruction of the temple. The first question, when will these things be? When is the temple going to be dismantled? You just told us that not one stone would be left upon another. When will this happen? And so we have the answer in Luke 21. Jesus told them what to look for. So Luke chapter 21, we're going to read verses 20 through 24. And Jesus said, "But when you see Jerusalem surrounded by armies, then know that its desolation is near. Then let those who are in Judea flee to the mountains. Let those who are in the midst of her depart, and let not those who are in the country enter her. For those are the days of vengeance, that all things which are written may be fulfilled. But woe to those who are pregnant and to those who are nursing babies in those days, for there will be great distress in the land and wrath upon this people. And they will fall by the edge of the sword and be led away captive into all nations, and Jerusalem will be trampled by Gentiles until the times of the Gentiles are fulfilled." That's very interesting, and I know we're reading some large passages of Scripture, but it's necessary for the context of it. Jesus just told them what to look for. When will these things be? He said, when you see Jerusalem surrounded. Now, we know that this isn't a fulfillment of all things, because he says this will take place, or Jerusalem will be lost, the Jews will be scattered until. So we know there's an expiration date on this event, but they were given something to look for. Now, I want to read to you some different things from what took place, because we know this was fulfilled in 70 AD. How many of you have seen some different TV shows or documentaries about the destruction of the temple, the overthrow of Jerusalem? This is a well-documented historical event, and it was fulfilled precisely as Jesus said it would be. Very, very precisely. In 66 AD, Jerusalem was actually besieged at the lead of a Roman general named Cestius Gallus. This individual besieged, he surrounded Jerusalem with his troops, and basically what took place was that the believing Jews remembered what Jesus said. And so they remembered that we're surrounded. When Jesus said, when you see Jerusalem surrounded, no, don't go in. If you're in, get out, leave. because this is going to be a time of distress and wrath upon the land and the people. You're going to be led away captive. You're going to be killed by the edge of the sword. Don't go in if you're out, and don't stay there if you're in. When you see Jerusalem surrounded, leave. So the believing Jews actually remembered this, but they couldn't leave because they were surrounded. So they were trapped. They knew it. They knew that they were supposed to leave, but they couldn't leave. But something very interesting happened. This individual actually made some miscalculations militarily and made some mistakes militarily and actually lost a large number of Roman troops. Now, this boosted the rebellion, right? The Jews fighting back thought, man, we are conquering a Roman legion, and they actually, Cestius Gallus had to initiate a retreat and leave, and he was even attacked during his flight. And he ended up dying shortly after that. He wasn't able to lead the successful besiegement, but because of some miscalculations, the siege was lifted. So then what happened? The believing Jews fled. They left. Many of them left, and they got out of there, and nothing happened to them. Their lives were spared. But 2 years later, something happened. History shows us that in 68 AD, Jerusalem was surrounded again, and this time there was no opportunity to flee. So it's very interesting that Jesus predicted, when you see Jerusalem surrounded, leave. Don't go in, get out. And the ones who did were able to go, and they waited out the war. But the ones who stayed, they thought, oh, it's over. They conquered, right? Sometimes we don't see visibly what Jesus is trying to communicate to us because He knows the future. So we have to live by faith. You act on what He said. You take Him at His word. You don't have to figure it all out. You just obey Him. So the obedient, believing Jews, they left, but many didn't. And the ones who stayed in 68 AD, Jerusalem was surrounded again. And this time it was surrounded until its total overthrow and the full destruction of the temple. How many of you have heard of Flavius Josephus? You know, he's a Jewish historian. He records that over 1 million Jews lost their lives in this besiegement. And tens of thousands were taken into slavery. They were led away captive. And then ultimately, what had been prophesied was that the Jews were scattered from their homeland. They fled, and Jerusalem was controlled by non-Jewish nations for the next nearly 2,000 years. And so this fulfilled these prophecies. And when the Jewish temple was burned by the Roman army, the heat was so intense that they had to let it cool. And after several days of the temple cooling, after it had been burned, they discovered that the tremendous amount of gold in the temple had melted under that heat and seeped into the crevices of the stones. And so the Romans systematically, stone by stone, dismantled the temple. Not one stone will be left upon another. Exactly what Jesus said would happen, happened, and they dug out of the crevices that precious gold. Isn't that amazing? God's the beginning, the end, He's all in between. He knows all of it. So here we have the very first question answered is, when you see Jerusalem surrounded by armies, get out of there. And so historically, we see the fulfillment of that. They dismantled it stone by stone. And unfortunately, many thousands of Jews were enslaved. Even more were killed. Exactly what Jesus described happened. It was a time of vengeance. It was a time of being slain. It was an awful, they squashed the rebellion in totality and actually scattered the Jewish people throughout the earth. Now, this is prophetic in this time. So we'll see these dots come together. But what Jesus said is so fascinating that it covers so much of end time. So that's the first question that they asked. It was answered, and it happened in their lifetime. The next question that they asked was, what will be the sign of your coming? But that's the last thing that will happen. So we're going to skip and we're going to talk about what will be the sign of the end of the age. Now, in the Jewish mindset, I'm not Jewish, and you may have Jewish lineage. If I do, I don't know it. But we think with a Western mindset, correct? In other words, it does us well sometimes to go and see the culture of these people, of the things that were said. And in the Jewish mindset, there was typically, especially in that day, 2 ages that they referenced. So it was the age that they were in, and then the age of the Messiah's kingdom. So they said, what's the sign of the end of this age? What's the sign of the end of the age that will usher in the next age? The age of the Messiah's kingdom, or what we call the millennium, Christ's reign upon the earth. What's the sign? Well, Jesus answered that immediately after he talked about the destruction of the temple. Look with me in Matthew chapter 24, verses 4 through 8. It says, Jesus answered and said to them, "Take heed that no one deceives you. For many will come in my name, saying, I am the Christ, and will deceive many. And you will hear of wars and rumors of wars. See that you're not troubled, for all these things must come to pass. But the end is not yet. For nation will rise against nation, and kingdom against kingdom. And there will be famines, pestilences, and earthquakes in various places. All these are the beginning of sorrows." Now, we're going to dig into this, and this will probably be the meat of what we talk about today. But I do want to mention what was covered in Luke's account. Right after Jesus said that, Jesus began to describe to them what their personal experience would be. In Luke chapter 21, verses 12 through 19, right after Jesus gives the sign of the end of the age, Jesus says this to his disciples, "But before all these things." So we know that this isn't a tribulational experience. This is an experience that happens before the sign of the end of the age. "Before all these things, they will lay their hands on you and persecute you, delivering you up to the synagogues and prisons. You will be brought before kings and rulers for my name's sake, but it will turn out for you as an occasion for testimony. Therefore, settle in your hearts not to meditate beforehand on what you will answer, for I will give you a mouth and wisdom which all your adversaries will not be able to contradict or resist. You will be betrayed even by parents and brothers, relatives and friends, and they will put some of you to death. And you will be hated by all for my name's sake, but not a hair of your head shall be lost. By your patience, possess your souls." Now, this is interesting, and I thought it'd be worth mentioning because if you continue reading, that could be misinterpreted as what is going to happen in the tribulation period. In fact, many times it's been preached as that during the tribulation period, don't worry about what you're going to say. But actually, these are the events that happened before the sign of the end of the age. These were the apostles' personal experiences. In fact, if you chart through the book of Acts, this is a almost word for word description of what the disciples and what the apostles went through establishing the brand new church of Jesus Christ. And you see Paul was brought before King Agrippa and these royalties, and it was an occasion for testimony, wasn't it? He stood before the king and he said, "I think myself a happy man." And he preached his conversion. He preached the vision that he had of Jesus Christ on his road on the way to Damascus. And he told them how he saved me and he delivered me. And he said, "I wish all of you were just like me except for these chains." He preached to the kings of the earth in that day. Exactly what Jesus said is exactly what they experienced. But before all these things, these will be your experiences. It's phenomenal. The precision, the accuracy. God said in the Old Testament, "I am God. There's none like me. I will tell you the end from the beginning." But let's go back to Matthew chapter 24 and let's look at the sign of the end of the age. The sign of the end of the age. First of all, he says, don't be deceived. He said, there's going to be people who come in my name saying, I'm the Christ. They will deceive many. There'll be wars and rumors of wars. He said, these things have to happen, but the end is not yet. Now, wars and rumors of wars in the most literal sense refers to local wars. I think many years ago, the last update I saw, that there were known to be over 15,000 wars from then to now. Local wars, right? There's wars in places we don't know about or that we're not even involved with. But it's very interesting that actually Jesus said, these things have to happen. The end is not yet. And so literally false messiahs and local wars are simply characteristics of the entire church age. But they're not necessarily a sign of the end. It's a characteristic of the entire church age. But then Jesus went on to say something way more specific. He said that nation will rise against nation, kingdom against kingdom. There will be famines, pestilences, and earthquakes in various places. All these are the beginning of sorrows. Okay, now the beginning of sorrows, you may have a margin in your Bible. You may have a translation that says this. The beginning of sorrows literally means birth pangs, or it's when a woman goes into labor and it's the contractions. And when those contractions begin, it's the beginning of the end of that pregnancy. In other words, that contraction, that set of contractions begins the birth of the new and the end of the old. In other words, this is the sign of the end of the age. When you see these things, meaning when they're coupled together, that indicates the current age is ending and the new shall be born in rapid succession. Now, this is fascinating because this is a description of something that at that point and for many almost 2,000 years had not happened. It's wars that are nation rising against nation and kingdom against kingdom. Now, that statement is a Jewish idiom. And basically, that Jewish idiom refers to total conflict in the area in view. In other words, in the Old Testament, when these terms were used, or even in Jewish culture, when these terms were used, what it meant was the entire area that's in view or in discussion is in conflict. Now, in the context of this passage, the world is what's in view, right? Jesus is talking about things that will affect the world. So the entire world is in view. So when Jesus said that, it meant that nation will rise against nation, kingdom against kingdom. It means that nations will go into conflict with one another until the entire world is in conflict. Something that's never happened. And then he goes on to explain pestilences and earthquakes and famines. And we know those had happened, right? In isolated or different terms. And you think about, was it the 1300s, with the Black Death? Nearly 60% of Europe was eliminated, but it was Europe. Now, we know that surely it affected other places and different areas had those things, and it was a pestilence for sure. But it wasn't coupled with earthquakes at the same time. It wasn't coupled with the famines at the same time, and it definitely wasn't coupled with global or worldwide conflict. So, you know where we're going, right? Yeah. World War I, it changed human history. Now, I like history, and I like to study, these type of things. It's very interesting to me. And it's fascinating because remember, World War I, they really didn't plan on another. They called it the Great War. It became World War I once another one happened. You're like, whoa. But what it did was it opened up the possibility of war on that scale. And in 1914, that began, World War I. The things that happened with and because of this war are absolutely remarkable, and it shows us tremendous fulfillment of what Jesus said. So let's look at a few things that go along with that, and we'll see here that we know in 1914 this took place. You know, how many of you study that? Does anybody like history like that? I enjoy it. But it's interesting, 1914, this came to pass. Just 21 years after World War I ended, World War II began. Actually, many historians believe that World War II was just a continuation of World War I, but we definitely could say at least World War I set the preconditions for World War II. The things that happened during World War I, it left a lot of open wounds and a lot of things politically in place, and it really created the ability for World War II to happen. But what we have is that in almost 2,000 years, nothing like that happens. And then at the turn of the century, in just the early 1900s, we have a tremendous boom of a global, worldwide conflict that matches exactly what Jesus said would be the sign, the birth pang, the first contraction of the end of this age. Now, I have to say this because we so easily get they say you miss the trees for the forest, or I don't know if I'm saying it the right way, but in other words, it's easy to get such a zoomed in viewpoint. But if you step back and see history, to us, we've always known that there's been a World War I, right? So it's not remarkable.
Thank you for watching today's broadcast. We pray that this teaching has further equipped you to fulfill God's plan for your life and to help you take your place as a laborer in God's harvest field. We want to say thank you to all of our partners. Your generous and faithful support make this outreach possible. If you aren't yet a partner, we ask that you prayerfully consider joining us by going to greaterharvestnow.com/partnership, or simply use the information on your screen. To stay up to date with everything happening at Greater Harvest Ministries, follow us on social media at Greater Harvest Now. Until next time, may you continue to abound in God's faithfulness.